So as Pastor Vogel mentioned, we usually use this segment for Baptist history. And then about once a month, not exactly, but about once a month, I'm taking a week, or in this case two, to discuss and just to talk about what I would call God's hand in American history, miracles in American history. And it's the idea that God has sustained and defended and stepped in at times, showed his hand when the United States, America, was at pivotal points in its history. And sometimes these miracles that we've studied so far have happened even before America was even thought of. And so last week we were talking about the little separatist church in Leyden, Holland, and how they decided that there was a little bit of religious freedom in Holland. This is a church from England that moved to Holland to have more freedom to worship. And there was some freedom in Holland, but it was not what they thought, and primarily they decided what was happening to their young people because of the wickedness of the people there was not worth staying. And so the church decided, that local church decided to attempt to go to the New World. That is not like moving to Ohio. Imagine that. And so they as it turns out, only 40 of the members got to go. The Pastor Robinson decided to stay back with the majority of his congregation. That must have been a heart-wrenching time, if you can imagine. And the man who most wanted to go decided he would stay with the majority of his people. And so this small group of people, Pastor Robinson, they elected William Brewster as their pastor, and they eventually made their way to England and on board the Mayflower. That's where we kind of left it last week. In August 5th, 1620, they set sail. Along the way, they endured, as you can imagine, fierce storms across the Atlantic. William Bradford, in his diary, said it was a long beating at sea, and the journey across the ocean almost failed many times. There's one very interesting part of the story on the sailover, and a lot of Christian school kids know this story, but Brewster and Bradford brought a printing press on the ship. Now you think about that. Why in the world would you bring a printing press? First of all, there's not enough room. We're going to see a cutaway of the ship here in just a minute. Very, very little room for the 100 and so passengers, which included the 40 members of this church. Very little room on board, crammed in there for almost 3 months. And what the story is that they had used this illegal printing press to print tracts and portions of Scripture in their evangelistic efforts in Holland. And this was illegal, of course, and at one point, even when they left Holland, they were in England, the King James's men, raided the homes of these people in Holland to find that printing press and to arrest them. The printing press had been taken to England and put on board the ship. And that's not the end of the story. About halfway across the ocean, the main beam, if you can see the next slide maybe, the main beam right in the middle of the ship broke. And that, of course, causes the ship it splintered and caused the ship to founder and roll on its side, and really everyone would have been lost. Bradford writes, as they scrambled to repair the beam, someone thought of the giant iron screw that was a part of the printing press. That giant screw that pulls the letters with ink down on the paper. And they took that screw, they put it in place, and it held the beam in place for the rest of the trip across the Atlantic. Now, that's just a little-known miracle that is just unbelievable. And people talk about this, and that is an overlooked thing in this story, is that printing press, which is very interesting. That printing press will have a role in America. It becomes the only printing press in America for years and years, and we've actually mentioned that, and I'll talk about that later. But amazingly, only one died on the voyage. And the ship arrived in Cape Cod on November 9th, 1620, 300 miles north, off course, from where they intended to land. They intended to go to Virginia, but now it was off course, but it's exactly where God directed the ships to land. And as difficult as that area of the New World would turn out to be, this is also one of the miracles that God performed, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And Bradford writes, being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean. And now the Mayflower passengers were faced with a new problem. Because they wouldn't be settling in Virginia, they had a patent that was no longer valid, a charter from England that was no longer valid. They were under no one's jurisdiction, and therefore they were subject to no formal laws or social arrangements. And the unsaved sailors quickly figured this out, and there began to be a rebellion growing. And the Pilgrim leadership had to act quickly, or there was going to be full mutiny on the ship as it was parked there in the harbor. Bradford described it. He said the Pilgrims huddled together among themselves and drew up an agreement, a sacred covenant, making them a civil body politic and promising just and equal laws. And if you remember, Pastor Robinson had written a letter to the church, those 40 people in his church before they left England. And one of the things he had mentioned about the temptations they were going to face on board the ship and the problems aboard the ship. But remember, the last thing was he said, you need to form a democratic government, a civil body politic, and when you arrive. And they did just that. And I want to take, the Mayflower Complex is very, very short. I just want to read a portion of it. They said, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do so by the presence solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue thereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, constitutions, and offices from time to time that shall be thought most meet and for the general good of the colony. Now you might say a minor document, and yet this is a pivotal document in the development of the United States. I'll mention this, but John Adams, whose great-grandfather signed this document, said this was the foundation of the American Constitution. And this is really a sacred document drawn up before God by a group of people that were intensely spiritual. And without God as the overseer, this would be nothing more than a piece of paper. And this is a wonderful document that these separatists put together. So it was November 9th. And they had little time to prepare for the coming winter. Bradford, knowing what was coming, he wrote a very cheerful tone. He said, they had much to be thankful for. Being thus arrived, as I said, in good harbor, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had delivered them, and again, to set their feet on firm and stable earth. And Bradford's diary, as we talked about, again, is going to be one of the most famous books in American history. And his account is one of very ordinary people who never could have accomplished what they did without the faith that God was looking out for them. And it's interesting to note a couple things about his diary. I just want to point them out. Is that he never says or hints that the Pilgrims doubted, even for an instant, God's commitment to them and that he would see them through this terrible tribulation that was about to happen. And many times they would read to each other scripture. They would pass each other and quote scripture to each other. One of the verses that was very popular was among themselves was Isaiah 41, 9 through 10. It said, you whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, do not fear, for I am with you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And the Pilgrims would encourage each other and quote this scripture to each other. And as I started to say, the difficulties of the journey and all that they had been through are very small and compared to the deadly winter that's about to follow. And he writes here, he says, that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 and 3 months' time, half of their company died, especially in January and February, being in the depths of winter and wanting houses and other comforts, being affected with scurvy and other diseases. They died sometimes 2 and 3 on a day, and sometimes of most distress, 6 or 7 sound persons. What he doesn't mention is one of them is his wife. And her death must have been terrible for him, but he never mentions it in his journal. This would be in character for Bradford because he never discusses his own suffering in this journal. He uses the words they and them. He never uses the words I or we. And I think that's really telling about a man who didn't want to engage in self-pity. In fact, he said at one time later, he said he was afraid that if he engaged in self-pity, the threat to the soul posed by the ego. I think, wow, can we take a lesson from that? And in the spring came the thaw. Now think about this. This is not a huge group of people. This is 40 people. Half of them die. Now there's 20 people left, just 20. I think sometimes we think of, it's a large congregation and it's a big group of people, and it's not. It's 20 people. There are 4 or 5 times that in the auditorium right now. And the starving time ended, as he called it, and then one of the greatest miracles of this whole situation happens. Out of the woods step 2 Indians. 2 men named Samoset and Squanto. And I said, this is one of the most amazing miracles that God performed. As I mentioned, they were 300 miles off course according to their calculations, but exactly where God wanted them to be. And what's amazing about this and the great miracle is that one of the Indians, Squanto, spoke English. Now, can you imagine that? And actually, he had partially, I think, as a slave, but he had sailed to England, had escaped. He has quite a story himself, and had been on another expedition that the English government put together. And he negotiated with the great tribe of Indians to help teach the Pilgrims hunting and fishing and how to plant corn. Bradford felt that Squanto was nothing less than a gift delivered from heaven, and there's no doubt that he was. And they signed a peace treaty of mutual assistance that talked about redressing any hurt or theft or aiding each other. This compact between the Indians was really an extension of the Mayflower Compact, and it would not be violated for over 50 years, the Indians and this group of people. The existing governor died, and our eloquent historian, William Bradford, was elected governor, and he would be reelected every year for the next 30 years as governor of the Plymouth Plantation. And God greatly blessed this tiny group of people. Instead of famine, Bradford wrote, now God gave them plenty, and the face of things changed to rejoicing in the hearts of many, for which they blessed God. And I guess I already alluded to some of this, but just a wonderful story that we want to thank the Lord for, and for this is part of our history. And maybe sometimes a story that's overlooked. There'll be more dramatic things happen in the next 150 years. But this story is really, just shows God's providence and His hand on America even before it was actually formed. As I said, John Adams said this was the foundation. This compact was the foundation of the Constitution that would be written more than 150 years later. And I just want to say just quickly, America was begun by men and women who honored God and set their founding principles by the words of the Bible. And they lived godly lives of honesty and reliability and fairness, which they found in Scripture. And this is one of the greatest chapters in human history is about to begin. And all because this small church had the courage to sail across the ocean. Pastor James Beller, who wrote a wonderful history of Baptists, he says, in one part, he says, referring to the Pilgrims, he said, the providential hand of God in helping these first Americans is a stunning study of the supernatural. And I want to thank the Lord for this and the stories, the wonderful stories to learn from these dear people.